Hi, Kris. Thank you for being here with me. Appreciate it.
Thank you. No, it's my pleasure. Great to be here, Juanjo.
Um, so I thought we could maybe start talking a bit about kind of the origins of the project and what kind of got all this started for a bit. Um, and as I guess as some of our audience will imagine, a first book in history normally, not always, but normally involves a project that comes out from your PhD. Is normally the dissertation. And I knew since very early on that I wanted to work in the Caribbean, but I wanted to somehow, and when looking actually what to do about the Spanish Caribbean, what could I do? I realized that everything was basically focused in very small places, right? In very places like Havana, for example, took a lot of attention, and maybe Veracruz and maybe Cartagena, but there was very little or almost nothing about Hispaniola in the 17th century. In order to find out some historiography about Hispaniola in the 17th century, you would have to go to the Dominican Republic and see what some historians have done there. But there is not even that much done in the 17th century in Dominican Republic. So that was intriguing, and so that became but I had also friends who actually being in the archive and said there is a lot here and by the archives I mean the Archivo General de Indias in Seville, right, which is also my hometown, which is very convenient. So they're telling me there's a lot of things here about Santo Domingo that nobody has worked on. So I thought, okay, so let's give that a try, right? So the 17th century was for me kind of the place to work, because it was also the least known period in the entire history of Hispaniola. If you get about Hispaniola and people who have worked on Hispaniola before, you get some people who've worked in the foundational period of the early 16th century, late 15th century, Columbus, and what it came after immediately, 1530s, 40s, the beginning of colonization of the Caribbean, and with Hispaniola in the center. And then on the other side, you have those who have worked on Haiti, right? About Saint-Domingue, Haiti, and what it came up, the Haitian Revolution, and what came after. So late 18th century, early 19th century. And in the middle, and particularly about the Spanish side, we don't have that much either, right? So that was a way for me. I knew that this could be interesting, or it could be important. And focusing on smuggling actually took a little more than that. I knew that what I needed to find, kind of what connects this entire period. Smuggling seemed the kind of the leitmotif, like the thing that kind of like brought together this entire period and explain some of the things that I was finding in the archives, some of the things that I was actually observing when reading these sources in the Archivo de Indias, right? The chronology is kind of like 17th century. Historians now are kind of like, as you know, Kris, we're always playing with the chronology, and 17th century is not exactly what 17th century was supposed to be. We're playing a little bit with that, right? For Hispaniola, it works kind of really well, because you have this kind of two momentous things that are happening in 1604, like the populations, which is one of the chapters focused on that. 1604, 1605, the crown depopulates the north and west of the island because people are engaging in contraband. So it's like a really kind of strong response from the crown. And on the other side, 1690s, you have the Treaty of Risquet and the formal division of the island in two, right? So if we think about how do we get to contraband before that, so I thought we take it back to kind of 1580s, 1570s. We have like a long 17th century that kind of helps think about the entire project, right? So that's kind of a little bit of the what kind of like brought me to this project. This and then smuggling became much like a much bigger thing that I thought it was going to be. Became kind of a way to understand a lot of things that are happening in Hispaniola, and hopefully connects with things that are happening in many other places.
Well, let me throw in my angle as the editor or co-editor of the series. When Matthew Restall and I got the proposal through Cecilia, we were kind of like, wow, this is completely different. This is something entirely new. We hadn't seen anyone working on the big picture of the Caribbean from the perspective of Hispaniola, and almost nobody, I mean, just a couple of exceptions. I mean, I won't name names, but there are a couple of other folks working on 17th century Hispaniola. But this project attracted attention for a couple of reasons. One was smuggling was also becoming a kind of historiographical scene for debate. Like, what does it mean to break the law consistently for generations in a place like Hispaniola or in Buenos Aires? You know, in the Cambridge series, we also have a book by David Freeman who treats a similar kind of story in mid-17th century Buenos Aires, where you know, in these places that are kind of peripheral in terms of their distance from Madrid and Seville, but also their distance from Lima or Mexico City, they enable certain local power groups to rise up, and in the void of imperial power in the 17th century, relative void, a diminished power from the center out into the periphery, these local elites kind of create new centers, and those centers have their own dynamic that I think has generally been misunderstood, in part because they're often seen from the perspective of Madrid. That is, if you take the crown's perspective, you say, oh, illegal, crazy, wrong, these people are out of control, they're dealing with pirates, they shouldn't be talking to foreigners, what are they doing, what could they possibly be thinking? And what Juanjo found, and what others have been starting to find, is that when you look at the various allegations and put them against each other, you start to get closer to a truth, which is a little bit harder to pin down. It's certainly ambivalent. It's not that what's going on here is legal, it's definitely illegal, but customarily it becomes understood like, no, this is the way things are done. Now, we had this old historiography. If you go back to John Letty Phelan's book of the Audiencia of Quito in the 17th century, that's the first book that came to mind when Juanjo's proposal came. I thought, here's a case where you can use some individuals in a core story, a couple of generations, particularly the Pimentel family, who are, if you read the book, you might be like, wow, these are some crazy people, or incredibly powerful. I mean, they look like a mafia family or something, but their story in a way encapsulates the dilemma, at least that's how I read it, of how the crown is readjusting to this growing Creole society that has its own desires and its own aims, and yet it still wants to proclaim absolute loyalty to the crown. And so you have this totally paradoxical situation of people becoming relatively autonomous, almost entirely autonomous at some level, and yet they're doing so in the name of the king, or they proclaim that they are. And this dilemma also brings us to this larger historiographical thing, a trend that's very popular right now in studying corruption. And I would ask Juanjo if he could just say how he feels this story relates to that historiography. So smuggling and corruption are kind of parts of the same story, but smuggling is usually seen as a specific sort of crime, whereas corruption is this much larger, vague, like, what is malfeasance? What does it mean to be? How do you even define that? Or is that an anachronistic term that we use today that's unfairly put onto the past? So maybe, Juanjo, you could talk about corruption.
Yeah. So first, I want to go back to something that you said that I think is very important. Is that kind of this idea of Hispaniola becoming a new center that I think is really interesting. And I find sometimes that historians, when looking at actually this, when thinking about this dynamics of central periphery, sometimes they're actually replicating what actually imperial subjects or imperial people, like imperial administrators from Madrid, think it's important. So that we're equating sometimes central periphery with important and unimportant, right, for the functioning of the empire. And I think historians need to move away from actually equaling periphery and unimportant and center unimportant. We're talking about dynamics, right? And every part, it's important in the system, right? So thinking about where places that have been traditionally called peripheries fit within the larger model, it's extremely important to understand how the model works at all, right? And that brings us to actually corruption and smuggling, which happens all across the empire. But particularly in those places, it's more important in those places where actually royal control is a little more tenuous, right? And Hispaniola, paradoxically, perhaps because there is an audiencia there, fits this model, right? So smuggling to me, it becomes, in particular in Hispaniola, it becomes a way for local people to access political power, right? And that obviously brings corruption into their role. They're not only participating in illicit trading, but they are actually bringing others, particularly bureaucrats, into the fold, right? In order to make this contraband, this smuggling happen, right? So let's say corruption in particular, the way I think normally about corruption is that the term corruption is that it's not a great term for what is happening to start. Definitely, we're talking about from the perspective of the crown, these are things that are wrong and that need to be stopped, right? And the people on the island and other places, they know that is that what the crown thinks, and they engage in a very lengthy campaigns of dissimulation with the crown in the correspondence that you see from people in writing from Hispaniola, for example, to the Council of the Indies. They are constantly presenting themselves as actually kind of loyal subjects, and they're never the ones who actually are corrupt or actually engaging in smuggling, but there are others, right? So they use smuggling as a political weapon to actually point at their enemies, and they say those are the people who are actually engaged in this problematic behavior. But the way I see corruption in this time is that it depends where we are. So it's very hard to pinpoint what is a corrupt behavior, right? Definitely the crown has a certain idea of certain types of behaviors that are considered illicit, right? And it tries to send judges to actually kind of catch them and sentence them. But those sentences, that for those in crimes, people can actually go free depending on where it's happening, right? So it's very casuistic. It depends where you are and the local circumstances to see who are the people who are getting punished. So thinking about corruption, I think corruption sometimes obscure the term itself, not the actions behind it, but the terms obscures more than explains. Because we have all these kind of 19th century ideas of what corruption means in a bureaucratic society, and those don't fit very nicely in my mind with actually early modern societies that are patrimonial societies in which the relationship between people in the administrative or bureaucratic chain, there are personal connections between them. There are not so much bureaucratic ones, right? So you get your position because you've done a favor to the king, or you do a favor to somebody who's put a good word for you, and then you become governor, or you become X, Y, and Z, right? So these are rewards. These are not people who are prepared, or they are kind of like, they didn't necessarily go to the university to become this thing, but they have done services to the crown and they have become this kind of this position, right? So they owe their allegiance to the crown and to the people who have vouched for them. And at the same time, they have people below who owe their allegiance to them, and they have to look after them, right? So in this context, corruption is a way to look after your people in a way, right? It's the only way to look after your people, to be a good patron. And at the same time, you do things for others because you're a good client of them, right? So as I said, I think it's in some ways it's part of the system. The crown is very much aware of it. It doesn't mean that they like it, and they try to stop it everywhere it happens. But in many ways, it's part of the system itself. It's what makes the system work. I don't think the Spanish Empire had lasted for this long if it wasn't because of this flexibility in the system that allow people to do things that were considered illicit, and they knew that were considered illicit, but it allows them to kind of live comfortably in a place in which most bureaucrats got ridiculous salaries in terms of how low they were and how late they came. People were in debt for years just to actually go to a position, to start serving a position. So in this context, how can we can we blame them? Yeah, to a certain degree, yeah, they know that they're doing something wrong, but in many ways, it's the only way to kind of like fulfill their aspirations, right? In this kind of like circle. Go ahead.
And so, yeah, I'll butt in here for a second and say, for those of you working on your first book, this is a great example of a title that really gets the whole argument into it. The title and subtitle together, Islanders and Empire. You see them, it could be Islanders versus Empire, it could be Islanders in the Empire, but it just keeps it open so that you don't necessarily have that opposition. And yet in the subtitle, Smuggling and Political Defiance. So political defiance asks us, okay, who's defying the crown and in what ways, or is that what defiance means? It's I think it beautifully draws readers in and says, okay, there's a dilemma here. There's a conflict, and it's a lasting conflict. It's one that changes over time. It's dynamic. It's not simply a crown versus colonist or Creole versus peninsular kind of conflict. It's a dynamic one that shifts over time. And I don't want to say that corruption. I'll disagree with Juanjo just a little bit here on corruption.
Yep, please.
In reading his own book, I'll say, well, what about Rodrigo Pimentel? Would you not call him a corrupt official? I think what you find is, even though there is this spectrum of behaviors that the crown disliked or even felt that needed to be stopped, but they kind of tolerated to a certain degree, there are points where a line is crossed and someone says, no, that's criminal behavior and that actually has to be stopped. And so I've kind of played this game with, okay, what's criminal and what's corrupt? Or is there a kind of spectrum, and okay, here now you've broken through into this other level. So I'll let Juanjo respond to that.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that I guess my only comment to that is that actually that line that separates them, it's constantly moving, and it depends where you are to mark where that line is, right? No, if you guys read the history of Pimentel, which is I think is chapter 5, I'm part of chapter 4 too. Actually, he appears on chapter 4 and then chapter 5. It's absolutely insane. I mean, this is a story of a guy who went above and beyond anything you can imagine, and he was at the end they had to send a special prosecutor because this was not. It was like 30 years of doing stuff like this, right? An accumulation of letters in the Archivo de Indias, in the Council of the Indies, of things that this guy had done. There were so many of them that at some point, the crown had to say, this kind of pass, right? We had to do something about this. But there's incredibly egregious cases like this one, right? There is another one in which also involved Pimentel that I'm working on right now for an article, in which basically a pirate escaped Santo Domingo, and he actually ended up raiding Veracruz in the 1680s, right? So when the Council of the Indies found out it was the same guy who had been in Santo Domingo, they sent a special prosecutor to find out what had happened, and the governor was sentenced to death. I mean, it was to that point, right? Because one thing is actually having contraband and letting people in and out. Another thing is actually letting a known pirate come in and out, and then this guy, basically cost us millions of pesos, right? So there is a line, without a doubt. But that line, it's kind of very, very flexible. It depends where you are. It depends the severity of the crime and in which way actually it affects the crime. The crime might be actually very serious, but if the crown is not affected in much in any way, it might actually, nothing might happen, right? So definitely, I think, and as you actually mentioned in some of the conversation we had, the campaign of dissimulation that actually these actors in colonial settings are engaged with when they write to the crown indicate that they clearly know what the crown's opinion is about these actions, right? And what they do. But I actually like this idea that you did as corruption as defiance. I think it's actually really interesting, right? Corruption in a way is a form of defiance of the crown. It's not breaking with the crown. They don't intend to break with the crown because this position that they occupy kind of on the fringes of the Spanish Empire benefits them enormously, right? They're not under close scrutiny. They can actually move around. They can be Spanish and at the same time trade with others. But they're constantly pushing the limits of what it means to be a Spanish subject, right? And it's in this kind of liminal space in which these guys thrive, precisely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good segue for maybe a discussion of sources, because one of the other things that drew me once I got into the manuscript as editor, I think Matthew and I both felt this way. Matthew Restall also read it. We thought it's unusual for someone in their first book to be so careful with setting allegations against one another and then trying to say, okay, there's something underneath here. I'm not going to read these sources literally because they're clearly out to make an argument for specific ends. And yet you have to let them talk. And so what I really think is critical is using a particular kind of source base, but reading not just between the lines or against the grain or whatever metaphor you prefer, but to actually set those arguments against each other and say, okay, what are these folks trying to get across? What's their ultimate aim? And then how do you come down to saying something like, all right, I think I understand what the motives of this person were in this instance, but I'll let Juanjo speak to the sources.
Yeah, so this book was really, I mean, every book is really hard. There's no doubt about it. Every history book is really hard to write. I was lucky enough to be for 2 years in the Archivo de Indias just doing research all straight, like 2 years, day in, day out, just if the archive is open, there I am. And I was able to accumulate an incredible amount of documents, more like over 4,000 documents to do this. That is not available, again, because Spain is Seville is my hometown. I could do that. That is not available to a lot of people. And I'm very much aware of that situation, right? But this is, working in Hispaniola has a lot of challenges. The first one is that there are hardly any sources left on the island. There are very few. There are some, there are baptisms, marriages, like in the cathedral, there are some records. And there are some small collections of colonial documents, but for the 17th century, they're very small. There are no notarial archives for Santo Domingo or for anywhere in Hispaniola. There are no the archives of the audiencia don't exist anymore. So there are some preserved in Cuba, but are for that they took them to Cuba when actually after the Haitian Revolution they took them to Cuba, and I think there are some of them are still in Cuba, but mostly for the 18th century. There is nothing for the 17th century. So all I had were the documents in the Archivo de Indias. These are documents, these are letters and correspondence that people in Hispaniola, either governors or other officials and subjects and citizens and residents who actually live in Hispaniola, sent to the Council of the Indies, and the responses that the Council of the Indies formulated that normally they keep a copy. And they keep a copy of those. They send the originals and they keep a copy, normally a draft, in Madrid, right? And now in Sevilla. So it took a long time to actually be able to do that kind of reading that Kris, that you were mentioning, because in order to understand the social dynamics at this level, I need to understand who was who and who was friend of who and how they actually interacted with each other. And that took a long time. It took a long time to kind of piece it together across 120 years to know. I saw myself doing genealogical trees. I was tracking who was members of the city council at what time. And I have an entire list year by year, every year that I could find, who was in city council, who was marrying who had fights against who. So I was tracking all this kind of local dynamics to then be able to read court cases. That's another source that we have. Apart from correspondence, we have also some court cases that the audiencia appealed to the Council of the Indies, and they are now in the Escribanía de Cámara section in Seville. So those cases, in order to understand many of these cases, and Pimentel's case is all there, you need to actually be able to understand how people relate to each other. And that is just, it was a very slow process of kind of piecing it together. It's kind of like I don't know how many legajos I read, but it was basically just putting it all together and then trying to kind of like in a database, trying to kind of like look for terms and trying to figure out how people, who they were interacted with. And it took a long time. It took a long time to do that. And that was the only way. The only way was actually to look document by document and be able to understand it. And sometimes also you need to reconcile different versions of what is happening, right? And I did that. And sometimes I might have gotten it wrong, but I was trying to kind of understand how different, because in the space of the book, you cannot actually give the entire case, what everybody's thinking. That there are like, for every case, there are like witness after witness after witness. And sometimes they say the same, except for one thing that is actually different, and it changes everything. So you need to kind of reconcile all that to kind of come with a picture of what is happening. And so that was the hardest thing, I think, to kind of to be fair to the subject, to try to do justice to the subjects, to understand what they're doing and why, and to understand also those who oppose them and why they're doing what they're doing, right? So I try very much not to fall in love with anybody, as historians sometimes do. I was trying simply to keep my distance of them somehow. And yeah, sometimes you put your hand in your head and think this is kind of incredible, but trying to kind of keep your distance to try to kind of understand what are the bigger dynamics, social dynamics in this society. For me, that was very important to have a narrative style, to tell stories about people, right? And to go deeper instead of actually kind of like try to connect a lot of things away from Hispaniola. I wanted to kind of stay in Hispaniola and go a little deeper instead of actually scatter myself trying to show kind of wider Atlantic connections, which I try to point at wherever I see them, but I don't want to explore them because that distracts me from my objective, which is actually do like a deeper analysis of society from top to bottom in a kind of in a long durée that there's this kind of long 17th century.
No, I think it does that. It's the islanders that are really at the center of the story. And I would just ask you one last thing to maybe comment on, which might have been, you make it look easy, but I thought, how do you do this? And that is to talk about Hispaniola rather than just Santo Domingo. And as you burrow into the power elite of Santo Domingo, and it's not just high society. I wanted to make this point too. I mean, Juan José also brings in many subaltern peoples whose stories would just otherwise never be told because they come in these court cases either as witnesses or as people who are accused of being the henchmen of the bad guy or whatever. So there's the class dimensions within Santo Domingo are very clearly laid out. But how do you deal with the rest of the island?
So I kind of let the narrative take me to different places. So, for example, the book starts kind of like island-wide, pretty much, right? I try to kind of, chapter 1 is kind of like an introduction of the history of Hispaniola all the way to 1580, right? And the second chapter is an attempt to kind of really picture kind of like the networks, the contraband networks across the island, right? So I try very much, and those are actually in the judge documents, right? The different judges who are trying to prosecute smuggling, and they have like these records of people all across the island from different towns and different places, and sometimes you find the connections between them. You find that one is a relative of this other guy, right? And or that he works with this guy in Santo Domingo. So you can see networks that really crisscross the entire island when it comes to contraband. So I start kind of island-wide, and then after the depopulation of 1604 and 1605, in some ways, most of the documents and most of the sources kind of concentrate, just like the people were forced to do, concentrate to Santo Domingo, right? And the interesting thing is that by the end of the book, we're against kind of island-wide, because by the 1660s, 1670s, you have the French who are little by little kind of populating the island on the west side. And so there is an urgency on the part of the Spanish to kind of repopulate some of the areas that they depopulated early in the century to not cede the territory to the French, right? So there is an active campaign to repopulate, and with repopulation comes also more contraband, right? So what you see is actually Santiago becomes a very important place at this time, also in the late 17th century, as it's becoming, an important point of connection with actually French Saint-Domingue. So I think there is an important dynamic of this book is actually this, there is kind of like a center periphery within the island that is very important. It's how kind of Santo Domingo, as kind of like the bureaucratic and kind of religious center of the island, how it relates to the rest of the island, right? And how in some ways tries to control them, tries to control the circulation of goods, the circulation of people. And they kind of succeed somehow in recovering kind of, by the late 16th century, Santo Domingo was losing his important place because the contraband trade that was going in the north was much richer and wealthier, right? So the north was becoming very important. After 1604, 1605, everything concentrates against the capital again. And then throughout the 17th century, you see how the north comes back again to become this predominant place, as becomes a special partner with Saint-Domingue, right? So this dynamic to me is very important, and I think it really drives the end of the book as well. That relationship between kind of northerners, like people from Santiago, and people from Santo Domingo, and that kind of relationship that they have, that constant dispute for control of this contraband, it becomes very clear. So I try to really go farther.
And that brings in the empire, where this is a really peculiar case where the crown actually orders people to leave a big chunk of the island because they're smuggling, only to allow foreigners to colonize that half of the island, which then they have to fight back against. So the empire is striking back and making these mistakes, or what turn out to be long-term mistakes, and that dynamic is always evident in the book. I think it's often easy to just say, in a lecture class, for example, oh, Hispaniola is only important at the very beginning. It's, as Juanjo said when he started, people have paid attention to it for the early era, the time of Columbus and some of the earliest reforms and the creation of the audiencia. But after that, it's really insignificant because it doesn't produce much. And it only becomes important again in the 18th century with the rise of Saint Domingue as a neighboring rival. But clearly, it's a center. It's a place that it's right in the middle of the Caribbean, and you can get to it from the coast of Venezuela, and you can get to it from Veracruz. You can connect to Puerto Rico is right next door, and so it's actually far more connected than, say, a place like Buenos Aires, which had its own South Atlantic connections to Rio de Janeiro and Luanda, Angola, and so on. So you have another sphere there, but Hispaniola really, everybody goes through. Sooner or later, people stop there on the way in or on the way out, and a lot of officials start their careers there. So you have a lot of audiencia officials and governors and other people who do their time in Santo Domingo, and then they go to Cartagena or they go to Bogota or wherever they go. And so it's a formative place, and they have to learn. It's a kind of nursery for bureaucrats to learn. Okay, this is what the Indies business is about. This is and if that's the experience they have, as Juanjo described, well, then get ready. Their corruption, whatever you want to call it, they're schooled in it.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, everybody, all the bureaucrats at the highest level of the audiencia are rookies in the Indies, right? Some of them might have been like lower governors or corregidores in some place, like in Mexico or somewhere like that. But at the level of like oidores and governors, they're all mostly rookies. So they are learning kind of the ropes as they go. It's also easy to forget the very strong connection that actually Hispaniola has with the coast of Venezuela during all this time, because even though the district of the audiencia keeps kind of like getting smaller and smaller as the 17th century goes, one place that continues to be under the purview of the Audiencia Santo Domingo is the coast of Venezuela and Caracas. So that connection is constant throughout the time. And when you actually look at where Pimentel has some of his best connections, is actually in the coast of Venezuela, So you can see how. And another aspect that I think is important is that throughout the 17th century, if Hispaniola is a center, who's benefiting from that center? Definitely not the Spanish Empire. But if you think that 17th century is the time in which, the English are settling, the French are settling, they are the ones who are actually benefiting like the most, from this illegal exchange. In some ways, you could actually claim that those incipient colonies in the Caribbean are being possible in part because this trade is there, right? So the metropolis is too far for them. The navigation is way too perilous. But you have willing trading partners right at 1 or 2 days sailing from where you are, right? So that it becomes an important place. If you want to understand the Caribbean in the 17th century, you need to understand the Spanish Caribbean. You need to understand Puerto Rico. You need to understand Hispaniola. You need to understand Eastern Cuba, right? Places that are kind of like outside the control of the Spanish monarchy, kind of like on the fringes, but people in there are very much interested in promoting this trade, right?
I think in all, it's a book that brings together the history of social networks, the kind of geographical spread of the Hispanic Empire, the Hispanic monarchy, as it was called, the Monarquía Española, something that is, the term empire also we tend to use like corruption with a 19th century mentality. And I think what Juanjo helps us do is to see that this 17th century Spanish Empire is really a different beast. And many people have suspected it and made this claim, but very few people have been able to describe it in a kind of granular detail that gives us a sense of, okay, these are the human beings who are creating empire and who are contesting its nature constantly, pushing its limits or trying to act within what they see as the very, rigid law that they learned back in Salamanca or wherever. It puts those things into conflict in a way that is human and manageable. And so I'm very pleased that it's in the series. It's really an honor to be a part of this.
Thank you. Yeah, it's one of those things that again, going back to actually giving a lecture about colonial Latin America, you want to kind of the students to get a sense of actually kind of the creation of a functioning bureaucracy, like across the empire, how important it is, right? And I think sometimes we kind of overplay that card, and we kind of students come up with a sense that this is kind of like a quasi-modern bureaucracy, like all powerful, that is kind of like extending their tendrils all over the Caribbean, all over the empire, right? All over the Americas, part of Asia. And it's only when you actually kind of start looking at how this bureaucracy and how these bureaucracies interact with local peoples that you really start to understand how kind of like how loose things can be at times, right? And how different from actually our modern ideas of bureaucracy these societies are and these administrations are, right?
Yeah, I think there's a certain organic quality that comes out here. And as I say, it's also partly that struggle between a crown that wants tighter control, but also has to cede power. I mean, ultimately, it's a book about power, and who is in charge of not just the dominion of this region, but collection of revenue. I think there's another aspect that, if we have time, just if you could say something about, the church is usually treated as a separate story, and here, there's a significant clergy in Santo Domingo, and yet they also get subsumed within these family networks, at least for a time. And just say something about that part.
Yeah, no, very quickly. Just like for many bureaucrats going to Hispaniola at Santo Domingo, go to serve as an oidor or as a governor in Santo Domingo, it's not a gift. It's seen in many cases as a punishment, something that you want to get out as soon as possible. Serving, for example, becoming a canon, for example, in the cathedral chapter in Santo Domingo, it comes a point in which there are no appointees from the Iberian Peninsula. There are no appointees. Nobody wants it, and there is a point that you can actually see which the crown appoints a person that lives in Spain, and they decline. They don't want to go because the money that they actually have, their congrua, or the money they have access to, it's so little that it doesn't allow them to subsist. So then we have an entire kind of, except for the archbishop that is always appointed, obviously in Spain, and comes from the Iberian Peninsula in the most cases, the entire kind of hierarchy of the church in Santo Domingo and in the island, it's people from the island. It's local people who have been educated in the university, in the monastery of Santo Domingo on the island, right? They have learned everything about religion on the island from people who are mostly local, right? So these are the people who actually occupy the church hierarchy. And as you can imagine, just because they're actually part of the church hierarchy doesn't mean that they give up their connections or their property to other local people, right? So they are deeply embedded in kind of the social networks, existing on the island. And that means that sometimes they participate in contraband, they actively participate in contraband, or they help justify it. They actually, there are, in the book, there are cases in which people come to confess, to come to actually seek confession from priests, because they realize they have bought illegal goods, right? This is early in the 1580s. And you have the priest doing this kind of very heavy lifting, telling them, don't worry, if you didn't know, this is not, this is not a sin. You don't have to worry anything about this. So, sometimes you have them justifying it, So you have the clergy. Normally, the archbishop is normally looking at all this and kind of criticizing it sometimes, and always saying that the religious knowledge of the clergy, local clergy, is it's terrible, that they don't know anything about anything that they're supposed to know. But at the same time, you have these local people who are really in control of, and there are times in which there's no archbishop in Santo Domingo for years, because they are old people and they die, and it takes 4, 5, 6 years to actually bring a new one. And who's in charge of the cathedral chapter? The dean, right? The dean is actually, and he's normally a local person. And in one case, it's actually Pimentel's brother. So this kind of explains, how local people get control not only of the audiencia, but also of the church hierarchy, of the machinery of the church from the cathedral. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I think I brought it up only because it adds that other dimension where the initial design of the empire might have been quite rational with its checks and internal, balances, but those only work when everything goes as planned. And they could work within the nation state, but not out in this distant periphery or places where, as you say, it takes 5 years for someone to get to a post. It takes them probably a year to figure out what's going on. And by that time, they've already applied for their next position. So I think we have...
we have some questions, right? Yeah. We have one question here. So Rodrigo Dominguez, researcher and professor at the University of Minho in Braga, Portugal. He says, I would like to ask Juan to talk a bit more about the overlapping between smuggling, illegal trans-imperial trade, and slave trade. I'm conducting some research that shows Hispaniola involved in a trans-imperial trade circuit between the pre-independence US and Portugal. How he sees the overlapping of for Hispaniola, for the case of Hispaniola. Yeah, it's interesting. People in Santo Domingo are constantly complaining, in Hispaniola, constantly complaining that there are not enough enslaved Africans arriving to the island, right? In fact, in the 1580s, one of the things that they are trading for is actually enslaved people. That's one of the things that they are acquiring. And later on in the 17th century, it becomes really hard to get slaves on the island. And the irony, though, is that they're constantly asking for slaves, but you actually have traces of them selling those slaves actually in more lucrative markets, right? So it's not unusual to actually take them to Cartagena to sell them, or they take them to Havana to sell them, because they can get more money for them, right? So I am not sure that actually, for example, they're selling enslaved people to actually non-Spaniards. I haven't found any reference to that. Normally, what they do is actually sell them in other Spanish ports. But they are definitely, but this is actually, this is common. This is actually quite common. This circulation of slaves, that the first landing is actually in Hispaniola, and then they're actually resold somewhere else. That happens from time to time, for sure. Let me see. I think there's another question here. Yeah, you mentioned Eastern Cuba and perhaps the case of Bayamo. Did you find any parallels and relationships between the subjects and those in Bayamo? Do they maintain networks in Santiago, Puerto Príncipe, and Baracoa? Fascinating. Yes. This is Handy Cuellar who's asking this question. So ironically, when the depopulations are happening in 1604, 1605, the entire town of the city of La Yaguana, which is actually not far from today's Port-au-Prince, they basically got into a ship of one of the residents, and they actually went to Cuba. They went to Bayamo. So, and the governor of the Audiencia is going to have to send an oidor to try to get them. And basically, so there are connections. There are actually strong connections of La Yaguana and other parts, maybe Montecristi even, like in the north, with Santiago and Bayamo, for sure. There is not a lot of documentation about it, but there are some evidence that there actually people are circulating normally easily from La Yaguana to Santiago. I have a case of a person who is actually a clergyman who lives in Jamaica, who is in Santiago on his way to Santo Domingo. So that triangulation is happening quite often. And I think that in terms of smuggling and contraband trade, there is a lot. There is a lot of connection. There is a lot of similar behaviors that are happening in Eastern Cuba that what is happening in Hispaniola. There's a lot of similarities. It's definitely like something that I would like to explore more, to see how the overlapping circles of this kind of like trans-imperial trade that are happening both in Eastern Cuba, definitely Hispaniola, and of course Puerto Rico as well. These places have a lot in common, I think. There is another question here. Question from Victoria Munoz. Hi, Victoria. City University of New York. I'm curious, given my research interest, whether there were any smuggling interactions with the English at the time, given how integral piracy was during the late 16th century. And in fact, the English were stealing slaves and cargo from Spanish ships and living from Seville from as early as 1562. Oh yes, there is a lot. There is a lot of that. There is one of the things that I cover actually in chapter 2, that talk about chapter 2, is how the English are. I talk about Drake, of course, Drake sacking Santo Domingo, which is an important kind of marker in the history of the island and in the relationship with the English. But the fascinating thing is that at the same time that the English are stealing ships that are coming out of the port of Santo Domingo, there are people in other parts of the island trading with those same pirates. So trade with the English starts pretty much after Drake sacks Santo Domingo in the kind of 1580s. The English are going to become, actually, English presence in the Caribbean is going to become very common, 1580s, 1590s. And they're all over the place. And piracy and being a pirate or being a smuggler sometimes are interchangeable. It depends. It's a question of opportunity. If you have the opportunity to rob a ship, you rob it. If you are not in a situation in which you can actually rob a ship, then you become a smuggler and you trade, right? There are cases in which actually local people trick merchants and rob them. There are some cases of that too. So it's kind of like it's a wild west, of course, of what is happening between the different people. It's a constant chess play between who has the upper hand and what am I willing to give, and in which situation, in order to actually ensure that I'm not going to be robbed and the other person is thinking the same. So the Spanish and the English are trading, and the English mostly robbing the Spanish quite often during this time, sacking sugar haciendas, like sugar mills. There are, in the south, they're doing all kinds of things during this time. All right. Any other questions? 3 great questions, actually.
Go ahead. Wonderful. Maybe a student of mine asked, well, why doesn't, if Saint-Domingue becomes this great sugar colony, why didn't that happen in Hispaniola? What went wrong there, if that's what you want to call it?
Yeah. Sugar mills require a huge investment to actually set them up. And there was no cash, circulating cash, in Santo Domingo, in the Spanish side of Hispaniola, to actually engage in something like that. And the crown was not in a situation to actually finance it, as it did in the early 16th century, 1520s, 1530s. The sugar economy that appears in Hispaniola, the first one in the hemisphere, it was heavily subsidized by the crown and private merchants, but mostly the crown, right? In the 18th century, there is no money to actually do something like that. But the main business that actually Hispaniola is going to engage in is actually the sale of cattle. Cattle is really important from the mid 16th century all the way to 19th century and beyond. Really, cattle ranchers are going to be some of the presidents of the Dominican Republic in the 19th century, right? So you have in the 18th century, what you have is actually Hispaniola specializes itself in selling cattle to actually Saint-Domingue. So let me turn it the other way around. Saint-Domingue would not have existed if it wasn't for Hispaniola providing a cheap and nearby close source of food. And they could actually, with this kind of source of meat, cheap meat coming in from right across the border, people in Saint-Domingue could dedicate most of their land to actually growing crops like sugar, like coffee. So the best crops, the best lands were actually dedicated to this because they didn't need to plant a lot of food because at least meat was widely available on the other side of the border. And that's going to start also in many ways. And this is a relationship that is founded really in the 1680s, starts in the 1680s, and I cover in the last chapter of the book. And that foundational relationship between Santo Domingo, the Spanish side, and Saint-Domingue is going to continue until the Haitian Revolution. It's going to be very important to understand the evolution of both sides of the island. All right. Let's see, any other questions?
In the meantime,
yeah,
why was there no money?
For the most part, people in Hispaniola were cash poor. They had land, they had cattle, they had sometimes slaves, but they didn't have a lot of cash. So you can see that in different ways, right? I mean, you can see that in, for example, the amount of money that they're actually spending in actually becoming city councilors, and the kind of coin that they're using to pay. It's the quality of the coin kind of like goes down tremendously, and the amount that they're paying is going down. At some point at the end of the 17th century, nobody's actually occupying these positions because you have to pay them in cash, and nobody has the money for it. So that's part of the issue. I think that's part of the issue, that they don't have cash. So that's, I think maybe in the 18th century things are going to change a bit with the trade, with the cattle trade, right? That things are going to change.
Looks like you've got one
question. Yeah, the last question, Rodrigo. Hi, Rodrigo again. Have you tried to cross-reference your sources with the Portuguese ones? Maybe this could put some light on the trans-imperial circuit established in the Caribbean as a platform for those empires. No, I haven't. I do talk a lot about Portuguese people on the island, and some of them clearly have connections, trans-imperial connections at some points. Either they have them or they're suspected to have them, right? The Portuguese are going to be, particularly after 1640, they're going to be constantly suspected of treachery, right? Of being working behind the scenes to basically to get the island to be part of the Portuguese Empire. So no, I haven't actually cross-references. They had some visits of Portuguese ships during the 17th century, not many. By the second half of the 17th century, what you have is mostly Dutch. The Dutch are the ones, particularly 1670 and onwards. Most of you have are Dutch ships stopping by. Some English and Dutch. The Dutch are dominating by the second half of the 17th century. That's for what I have, which is not a lot, granted, because there are not a lot of sources of ships arriving to the port of Santo Domingo. It's very limited. You have reports, people writing, there hasn't been a ship in 6 months, but you don't actually get, a ship arrived and it was this kind of ship. Maybe I have found like 3 or 4 documents in which they provide a list of ships that arrive by the contadores, right? By the accountants, and those accounts are always very suspicious because you never know what are saying, what they're hiding, right? But yeah, it would be interesting for sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, one final question.
Okay. Raul Alencar, do you have the opportunity to research how the relationship between the Spanish and the French on the island transformed by the beginning of the 18th century with Bourbon rule in Spain? No, that was actually that I decided very much actually stop the project with the Habsburgs. I didn't want to get into the Bourbons because that takes you an entire different project, right? That takes you an entire different direction. And I suspect that relationships actually between between the governor of the Audiencia, for example, and the authorities on the island with local people is going to be transformed. There is an important rebellion actually in 1712, 1713 that has to do precisely with this transformation, right? How the governor of Santo Domingo is trying to kind of reestablish their authority on people in the north, and the people in the north are going to rebel. I make reference to it in the conclusion, but I don't actually pursue Bourbon reforms or anything in the relationship with the Bourbons. The book really ends in 1690s.
That's the next book.
That's hopefully, who knows?